It's this river that brings joy to the city of our God. And because God is a God of refuge and strength, it's in his presence, the river of his presence, that we find both. Can you imagine what life would look like if God's presence flowed out from your relationship with him in such a way that it impacted every area of your life? I pray that you sense that invitation in this episode and every episode that you watch of this series. So, I want to share invitation number 16. In the river of God's presence, you find refuge and strength, and a dwelling place that will bring you joy. Psalm 46, 1-4. God is our refuge and strength, always ready to help in times of trouble. So we will not fear when earthquakes come and the mountains crumble into the sea. Let the oceans roar and foam. Let the mountains tremble as the waters surge. A river brings joy to the city of our God, the sacred home of the Most High. In Revelation 22, John saw this same river. And he talks about it being filled with the water of life that's as clear as crystal, and that it flows from the very presence of God. It's this river that brings joy to the city of our God. And because God is a God of refuge and strength, it's in his presence, the river of his presence, that we find both. It is possible in his presence to not be afraid, even in the most difficult times. As I pondered these verses and I imagined this river flowing from the throne of God into his city, his home, the place that followers of Jesus are going to live with him someday. And I thought about what he did on the cross. I just was overwhelmed by the way that he made the way for us to find this dwelling place now. Now, it's not going to be the same. We live in a fallen world, obviously. But there is a way through Jesus to access the presence of God no matter what is going on. Because the scripture says that when he died on the cross, the veil that was in the temple that actually separated the place of God's presence, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was in the temple, the veil tore in two. And it spoke of the fact that no longer would we have to go through a priest or someone else in order to access God, but that Jesus himself made the way for us to be able to be before him. And so even in the most difficult of times, we can access this place, the presence of God. And, I don't know about you, but for me, when I'm in difficult times, that's actually when I kind of feel the enemy around me more. Remember, this realm around us, light, dark, good, evil, angels, demons, Satan. The enemy is around us wanting to hold us back. He brings loneliness, discouragement, despair, fear, hopelessness, even depression sometimes. And the human tendency is to isolate ourselves away from God, away from his presence when we're in that place, when it is the very thing that is going to help bring us out of it. It's the very thing that's going to restore joy to our souls. The very thing that's going to help us is often the thing that we avoid. It makes no sense. And yet, it can be so easy to do, even when you've walked with God for a long time. I pray that you and I will remember during these difficult times to avail ourselves of what Jesus has made a place for, that we would still come into his presence, that we might find the refuge and the strength that gives us that place of renewed joy. So I'm going to share a story from the Bible that illustrates this. In 1 Samuel 20, David fled to Naioth in Ramah after Saul tried to kill him. And David finds Jonathan. Now, Jonathan is Saul's son, and Jonathan and David are friends. And he asked Jonathan what he had done to offend his father. And at first, Jonathan didn't believe that Saul was actually trying to kill David, but David swore to him that it was true. And so Jonathan asked how he could help, and David had this plan. And his plan was that he was going to go and hide away during the new moon festival. And he asked Jonathan to tell his father that if he asked about David, to tell him that he'd asked for permission to go home and make an annual sacrifice on behalf of his family. And David knew that if Saul lost his temper, that it would be a sign that he wanted to kill David. So Jonathan said he would talk to his father. He promised that he would be loyal to David. And so David goes out to this place and he hides, and he's waiting by this stone pile. And the plan was that after the festival, Jonathan said that he was going to shoot 3 arrows out into the field, and then he was going to send a young boy after them. And when that young boy got there, if David heard Jonathan tell the boy, "Hey, go farther," that would be an indicator to David that Saul was indeed after him. And so they laid out this plan. So when Saul noticed that David wasn't at the festival meal, he was enraged. He just didn't accept David's excuse. And he told Saul Saul told Jonathan to go and get him so that Saul could kill him. And when Jonathan questioned him, Saul became so angry that he hurled his spear at his own son. That is how angry he was. So with this, Jonathan realized that indeed Saul was going to try to kill David. And so he carried out the plan just as he promised, giving David the warning. And David was so moved by Jonathan's warning that he bowed 3 times to Jonathan with his face to the ground. Now, while it was Jonathan who warned him, and obviously this plan was kind of working out between these 2 men, David attributed this protection to God. In Psalms 11 and 64, we read about his experience fleeing from Saul. And in Psalm 11, he wrote that he trusted the Lord for protection. David knew that the Lord was ruling from heaven and watching him closely. So we can learn from this. When we are in situations that seem impossible, when we are in situations that are uncomfortable, when we are in situations even when our life is on the line, God is still there. We can trust him to be with us in those places. In Psalm 64, he asked God to protect him from his enemies' threats, and he shared his heart about what he was going through. And it's important that we hear this because, God does not expect us to be perfect. He gave us emotions with which we feel things and experience things. So when we're going through times like this, it's okay to be real with God. David was. And the scripture calls him a man after God's own heart. You want to be real with the Lord about what you're experiencing during this time. But I also want to encourage you with this. When you read the Psalms, it's pretty clear that after David does any lament, he still comes back to that place where he envisions God and he speaks of who God is. In verse 7 of Psalm 64, David wrote with confidence that God would shoot down his enemy. He knew that everybody was going to see God's mighty acts. And he ended the psalm by writing that anyone who is godly take their delight and joy in the Lord, and they find shelter in him. That's his encouragement. That's the exhortation to you and me, that no matter what is going on, in the river of God's presence, we can find refuge and strength, and that in that place, we can actually experience joy, just as David did. Now, obviously, this story is a pretty intense story because David's life was on the line. And it's true that God is with us during those times. It is also true that there are things that happen in our lives that are not of that great of consequence, it seems, and are really more about our own insecurities and our own doubts and our own complaints and all of that. But I want to encourage you that God is with us in those times too. And in those times, we can find a place of refuge and strength and joy. And so I'm going to share this next story with that heart. Most certainly, my life was not on the line, but it still was a situation that God cared about. So when I got married, I moved from Colorado to the United Kingdom to live with my husband where he was from. And I had visited the UK several times before I moved there. And I had made a lot of friends and I loved the culture. I'd even lived there for about 5.5 months, attending a school of ministry in 2000. And, honestly, it was like God had done everything he could to prepare me for living in the UK. But visiting somewhere, even if you've lived there for a short time, is different. It's different from when you're going to live there permanently. And soon after I moved, even though I was happy to be married, even though I loved my husband, I found myself homesick. And there are many wonderful things to celebrate about the UK, but there were also things that were just difficult for me about living there. Getting used to the rain, getting used to really narrow roads, getting used to small cars. There were different measurements for cooking, so they used Celsius. I was used to Fahrenheit. I didn't have a license, so I had to travel by bus or train, and all of these things were really overwhelming to me. And again, I realized that these are small things, but they were things that were causing me to be homesick and to be sad. And not only that, but I'm Mexican American. I'm from a culture that, generally speaking, is loud and boisterous. We get excited about things. I'm an extrovert. I have a loud voice. I have a loud laugh. And I usually share pretty openly and easily when I meet people for the first time. And that is very different from how the Brits are, generally speaking. And so I felt out of place in the British culture. And as much as I loved Ian, and as happy as I was to be newly married, I still found myself in tears 2 or 3 times a week. And that was kind of the first couple of months of living there. And I was so thankful that God stores every one of our tears in a bottle. That's a promise in Psalm 56, verse 8. And it was during times of just really deep times of prayer and worship that I gained the strength and the peace that I needed from Jesus. Now, a couple of months after I moved, it was Christmas time, and Christmas is my favorite time of year. And I love decorating, and I love cooking, and I love everything about Christmas. And because I love that, Ian was excited to take me to a particular store for the best selection of decorations. And in my head, I was thinking about what America looks like at Christmas, which is a little bit ridiculous, to be honest with you. It's like aisles and aisles of stuff to buy, aisles and aisles of choices. And that was what was in my head as we went to this store. And when I got there, there was a small selection of decorations, comparatively speaking. And I realized that this is a ridiculous thing now. But at that time, it was sad to me. It was like, all this expectation kind of deflated. And so to someone who was as homesick as I was, struggling to adapt to my new home in the UK, it was like I was thinking that Christmas was going to pull me out of this funk and somehow buying stuff was going to help that. And so this turned out to be disappointing. And I turned to Ian and I said, in America, and I didn't even finish my sentence, and he interrupted me. And my husband is British. He has a beautiful British accent. And he said to me, yes, my love, but you're not in America. And I responded with a laugh because I knew when he said it that he'd been holding that in for a while. I knew it wasn't like the first time he'd thought it. And I then realized in that moment, I've been starting a lot of my sentences like this since I've moved. And so I realized that my sadness, the place that I was in, it was because I was doing this comparing. I was comparing the United States to the UK, and they are different places. And as I spent time with him, I realized how much I had been complaining. And I did not know, even though I understood it, I did not know how to change my attitude. And so I just sat with him and I was like, Jesus, I need your help. This is where you've called me to live. And I do love the UK and I don't want to be sad about these things. Would you show me what to do? And in the still small voice of my heart, I just sensed him encouraging me to take everything that I found challenging about living there and find something positive in it. And so when it rained, because it rains there a lot, and I'm from Colorado, which if you don't know, Colorado has 300 plus days of sunshine. That was what I was used to growing up. And so when it rained, I was like, okay, I miss the sun, but because it rains, everywhere I look, I see beautiful green grass, shrubs, and trees. And then when I got irritated at living in a small house or driving in a small car on narrow roads, I thanked Jesus that because that's the case for many people in the UK, in fact, most of the people in the UK, it means that within 15 minutes, generally speaking, most people can get to the countryside, and gorgeous countryside. And then when I, got frustrated because I was cooking and I didn't know how to cook with, metric measurements and Celsius and Fahrenheit and all of that, thing, I was like, okay, but I'm learning something new. That's a good thing. And every time I was disappointed at the lack of choices for shopping, which again, I realized is just so ridiculous. But I thanked him that he was helping me learn how to desire less and spend less. And every time I found myself not sharing as much as I normally would, not laughing or speaking as loudly as I normally do, I thanked him that he was helping me to learn to prefer others and to appreciate a different approach to life and to respect it and to honor it. That doesn't mean that I stopped feeling homesick and lonely. But as my way of thinking changed, it no longer overwhelmed me. And Jesus was my refuge and my strength in that season. He showed me how to take joy in what I found challenging. And as that happened, I then started to have joy just in my new life in general abroad. And that joy ended up leading to a deep love for that country. Now, I now live in the United States with Ian, but I am so happy to say that with that change, over time, the United Kingdom became as much home to me as the United States. And I miss it, and I'm homesick for it. But I'm not in the place that I was before because I know that I am where I'm supposed to be. I'm taking joy where I'm supposed to be. In the river of his presence, he helped me find refuge and strength, a dwelling place that brought me joy. Now, there are obviously difficult circumstances that happen in our lives. This is something that's maybe seemingly small, and I understand that. But I want you to know, no matter how big or small the situation is, Jesus wants to be with you through it all. And he's available to be with you through it all. So I want to share a more difficult circumstance. My life was not on the line, but it was definitely a very difficult season of life for me. So I was working, I had a job, I was working for someone. And before I went to go work at this job, kind of the way that I was in normal life in terms of my work and ministry and what I was doing at church and things like that, it just seemed like a lot of things came very easily to me, that God had gifted me with gifts of administration and, just ways of planning and, just kind of crossing all the I's or crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, taking care of details that were important. Well, when I went to this job, all of a sudden, it just seemed like I was making mistakes all the time and very seemingly ridiculous mistakes, like things that I should have easily known. And so I kept getting in trouble for it, called on it by my boss, who was like, you can't do this. I need you to do this. I need you to do that. I need you to do this. And every time he would call me on something, I would cry. And I just couldn't help myself. Now, if you saw another episode, this is during the time when I still had those performance issues, when my identity was tied up with how I performed. And so I'm still in that place, And so I would cry, and that would make him uncomfortable. And finally, one day, he just said to me that he felt like I was trying to manipulate him with my emotions. And I can't even tell you what that did to my heart. I couldn't believe the accusation because that certainly was not what I was trying to do. And so, of course, that led me into tears and I was crying for, felt like a whole week straight. And finally, at the end of that week, I remembered something that one of my spiritual fathers told me a long time ago. And he said, the truly humble, when given a correction, will look for even the 1% that is right. And the truly meek will give up the right to being right. And so as that came to my heart, I was like, okay, God, you've allowed this. You're the one who brought me here to work in the first place. You knew how difficult it would be. You knew that I would make all these mistakes. You knew that it would disappoint my boss. You knew that he would think that I was trying to use my emotions to manipulate him. So, what are you doing in all of this? What do you want to accomplish in me? And what I heard in the still small voice of my heart is the Lord saying to me a different correction. So what he said was, you're not using your emotions to manipulate him. He said, but if you didn't struggle so much with thinking that you have to do everything perfectly, you wouldn't cry when you're corrected. And I knew it was true. And I knew what God had designed in that whole situation that came up is he wanted to cleanse me of that. He wanted to change me in that area. He wanted to transform me so that I no longer thought of my worth, my acceptance being tied into how I performed. And I knew that as he did that healing in me, that I would no longer cry when I received those corrections. And so I asked him, I was like, okay, that was part of the healing that he took me through in that season of needing to be delivered from that performance complex that I talked about. And it was not easy. I kept making mistakes. I kept getting in trouble. But over time, God healed me so that I no longer responded the way that I had once responded. So in that place, as I sat with him in his presence, he helped me find the refuge and the strength that I needed. And over time, I was able to find joy in that job. I was able to okay, this is not easy, but you say that you are my joy. And I'm going to believe that, and I'm going to lean into you for what I need. For whenever I get in trouble, I'm not going to let my identity get wrapped up into that. I'm going to believe what you say about me instead. And in that place, I was able to find joy. So we're going to spend a few minutes with Jesus and meditate on Psalm 46, 1-4. So I want to encourage you wherever you are to just get comfortable. Take a minute to just pause. Make yourself aware of the presence of Jesus. Jesus is there. God is always with us. Just take a moment to sense his nearness. I'm going to read Psalm 46, 1-4, and I want to let you take it in. Ask God to breathe his life into you as I read. God is our refuge and strength, always ready to help in times of trouble. So we will not fear when earthquakes come and the mountains crumble into the sea. Let the oceans roar and foam. Let the mountains tremble as the waters surge. A river brings joy to the city of our God, the sacred home of the Most High. Now, if you're going through a difficult time right now, I want to encourage you to pour your heart out to him. Ask his Spirit to comfort you. Ask him to help you find refuge and strength in his presence. Just going to give you a moment to do that. Ask him for his perspective on your circumstances. Now, if you're not going through a difficult time right now, ask Jesus to remind you of a challenging time you've had in the past. Just reflect on it and think about how you managed through it. If you're going through a difficult time, ask him how it is he wants to bring you into that place of refuge and strength that will bring you joy even in the midst of what you're experiencing. And if you're not going through a time like that, think about this time that he brought to your heart at that difficult time. During it, did you avail yourself of him and his presence? Did you avail yourself of his desire and his willingness to be with you in that process? If so, how? And if not, why not? Ask him to help you understand an aspect of his nature that can help you through this difficult time. Or if you're thinking about something from the past, what was it that he was wanting to reveal through that situation? I want to encourage you this coming week to take some more time to think about this meditation and just what Jesus brought up. Ask him to speak to you even more about it. As close as you can to, after watching this episode, I just want to encourage you to journal what it is that you sensed coming to your heart and write down anything that you sense from him. And also write down your prayers. Pour out your heart to him. Ask him to reveal even more of who he is. I'd like to close in prayer. Father, I thank you so much that you are a God who loves, that you are a God who hides us under the shadow of your wings, that in your presence we find refuge and strength and joy. Thank you that no matter what it is that we go through, that we can experience joy because of who you are. Our joy is not dependent upon what is going on in our lives. Our joy is a fruit of your Spirit working in and through us. And so I pray, Father, that in the midst of whatever circumstances people are going through that are watching this, that you would help them find you. May they avail themselves of your presence. Receive that refuge and strength and that joy. I pray these things in Jesus' holy name. Amen.